I didn't know I was being replaced when my boss asked me to train someone new. I thought I was being trusted. That's the part that still bothers me, not the layoff itself. The moment when I realized the trust was fake and the request was a setup. I'm a compliance analyst at a mid-sized SaaS company. Not a flashy role. No sales bonuses, no stock tweets, no Slack applause. My job was to slow things down, ask uncomfortable questions, and make sure the company didn't accidentally step on a regulatory landmine. I was good at it. Quietly good. The kind of good that only gets noticed when something goes wrong, and suddenly it hasn't. For 3 years, my performance reviews were solid, reliable, thorough, level-headed. I didn't chase promotions, but I also wasn't invisible. I built processes people used. I documented decisions. I kept emails. That last part matters. 6 months ago, we got a new director. Let's call him Mark. He came in with the usual energy. Big smile, fast talk. Lots of phrases like moving fast and breaking silos. On his second week, he booked a one-on-one with me. Said he wanted to learn the terrain. I believed him. That meeting was friendly, almost too friendly. He complimented my documentation, said he liked how buttoned up my work was. Then casually, like it was an afterthought, he mentioned they were bringing in a contractor to help with bandwidth. "I'd like you to get him up to speed," Mark said. "Just walk him through your workflows." I asked the obvious question. "Is this temporary coverage or a new role?" Mark smiled. "Let's just say leadership wants redundancy." That word stuck with me. Redundancy. In compliance, it's a good thing. In headcount conversations, it's not. A week later, the contractor joined. His name was Evan. Early 30s, confident in that way people are when they've never been held responsible for consequences. He wasn't bad, just incurious. He asked for access to systems before asking how they worked. He took notes, but never asked why something existed, only how fast it could be done. I started the training the way I always do. High level first, what we're regulated under, where the risk lives, why approvals matter. Evan nodded along, but his eyes kept drifting to his laptop, Slack messages, calendar pings, somewhere else he needed to be. After the first session, Mark messaged me privately. "Good start. Tomorrow, can you show him how you approve exceptions?" That was odd. Exceptions were sensitive. They required documented justification and, in some cases, legal sign-off. Not something you demo casually. I replied carefully, asked if legal was looped in, asked what level of access Evan had been approved for. Mark responded 5 minutes later. "Let's not overcomplicate this. He just needs to understand the flow." That's when I felt the first real twinge of unease. Not panic, not anger, just a quiet internal note. Pay attention. Over the next 2 weeks, the requests escalated. Evan needed access to our risk dashboard, then our audit logs, then the exception tracker. Each time, I asked for confirmation. Each time, Mark told me to keep things moving. I noticed something else, too. Mark stopped inviting me to meetings I used to be in, strategy syncs, planning calls. Instead, Evan was there. I'd hear about decisions after the fact, usually framed as already aligned. One afternoon, Mark dropped a meeting on my calendar titled Knowledge Transfer. No agenda, just the two of us and Evan. During that call, Mark said something that changed how I heard everything after. "Think of this as future-proofing," he said, "so no single point of failure." Single point of failure, that was me. I ended the call politely. I sent Evan the documentation links instead of live access. I followed up with Mark via email, summarizing what I'd shared and what I hadn't, and why. He didn't reply. That night, I went back through the last month of messages. Slack, email, tickets. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. But a pattern was forming. Requests without context. Pressure without confirmation. Access without approvals. I didn't feel betrayed yet, just alert. The way you feel when you realize the road is narrowing and no one told you there was a merge ahead. I still believed at that point that if I stayed professional, if I did everything by the book, it would work itself out. I was wrong. By the third week, the tone changed. Not openly hostile, just colder. Shorter replies, fewer explanations, the kind of shift you notice only after it's already settled in. Mark stopped messaging me on Slack and started emailing instead. That alone wasn't suspicious, but the emails were vague in a way that made my job harder. Can you expedite this? Let's move forward on access. Assume approval unless there's a blocker. No ticket numbers, no references, no one copied. So I replied the only way a compliance person knows how, slowly, clearly, and in writing. Happy to proceed. Can you confirm legal has reviewed? Before granting access, I'll need the approval chain documented. Just to be explicit, this exception would normally require sign-off. Every time there was a pause, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, then a reply that didn't answer the question. Let's not get stuck in process. We can clean this up later. This is how leadership wants it handled. Leadership, another word that means nothing until it means everything. Evan's role expanded quietly. He stopped shadowing me and started speaking for the team. In meetings I wasn't invited to, he'd present decisions I hadn't seen. Once, a product manager messaged me asking why compliance had approved a workaround I'd never heard of. I checked the logs. My name wasn't on the approval. I flagged it to Mark. He replied, "That was verbal. We aligned earlier." We hadn't. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I documented. I followed up with a summary email. Neutral, factual, almost boring. For clarity, I have an approved X. If this is moving forward, we should retroactively document rationale and sign-off. No response. Instead, 2 days later, HR scheduled a check-in. No context, just a calendar block. The meeting was polite, too polite. They asked how I was feeling, whether I was keeping up with the pace of change, whether I felt aligned with the new direction. I answered honestly. I said the volume was manageable, that the direction was fine, that my only concern was process clarity. HR nodded, smiled, took notes. That afternoon, Mark sent me a message. Need you to prioritize Evan's access today. Execs want this live before end of week. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, because now it was clear this wasn't about training anymore. It was about speed and risk and making sure someone else could do my job without inheriting my caution. I asked one more time for written approval. Mark replied within seconds. "I'm approving it." That sentence mattered, because it meant responsibility had a name attached to it, and it wasn't mine. I granted access exactly as requested, but not quietly. I logged it, I tagged it, I noted the deviation from standard review. I attached the email. That night, I went home and couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from irritation, from the slow, grinding sense of being pushed aside while still being expected to hold the line. And then I realized something that snapped the irritation into focus. They weren't just replacing me. They were trying to make it look like I agreed with it. That night, I stopped assuming good faith. I started assuming preparation. The breaking point didn't come with a confrontation. It came with a calendar invite. Friday afternoon, 4:30 p.m. Subject line: process alignment. Attendees: me, Mark, legal ops, and someone from internal audit I'd never met before. No agenda. No prep doc. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Not because I was scared, but because I finally understood the shape of what they were building. I spent the next hour pulling everything, every email, every Slack thread, every access request, approval log, and ticket comment. I didn't editorialize. I didn't highlight. I just organized it by time. And that's when the patterns stopped being subtle. Requests from Mark always came before approvals existed. My follow-up questions always went unanswered. Then hours or days later, Evan would move forward anyway, usually citing alignment or verbal confirmation. And when something needed to be justified after the fact, my name would quietly appear in the narrative. Not in writing, just implied. I didn't know it yet, but that decision to keep everything had already saved me. The meeting itself was calm. Too calm. Mark did most of the talking. He framed the last month as our growing pains, said there had been confusion around ownership, suggested that I'd been hesitant during critical moments. I let him finish. Then Legal Ops asked a simple question. Can you walk us through how exception approvals were handled during that period? Mark looked at me. So I did. I shared my screen. Not dramatically, not defensively. I showed the workflow as it was documented. Then I showed how it had been bypassed. Then I showed the emails where I'd flagged it. Then the follow-ups that never got responses. Then the message where Mark explicitly said, I'm approving it. No commentary, just timestamps. The room went quiet in a very specific way, the kind of silence that means something's gone wrong, but no one wants to say it yet. Internal audit asked for copies. Legal ops asked for access to the logs. Mark leaned back in his chair and said nothing. The meeting ended without resolution. No next steps. Just, we'll circle back. That night, Mark messaged me. You blindsided me in there, I replied once. I answered the question. He didn't respond. The following week was chaos disguised as normalcy. Evan's access was suddenly under review. Meetings were rescheduled, then canceled. People who hadn't spoken to me in months started asking oddly specific questions about timelines and approvals. Then HR scheduled another meeting. This one had legal copied. I went in prepared. Not emotionally, structurally. They told me there were concerns about process adherence, about exposure, about accountability. Then legal asked if I'd be willing to walk them through my documentation again, privately. I realized in that moment that I wasn't being evaluated anymore. I was being used as a reference point. That was the small internal snap. Not rage, not triumph, just clarity. I'd spent weeks thinking I was defending my job. I wasn't. I was documenting someone else's mistake. And once I saw that, I stopped trying to be agreeable. I started being exact. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unraveled. Monday morning, my access to 2 systems was temporarily restricted. No explanation, no warning. Just a quiet lockout that told me everything I needed to know. Someone was scrambling, and scrambling always leaves fingerprints. Mark didn't speak to me directly anymore. He communicated through HR, short messages, carefully worded, phrases like, while we review, and out of an abundance of caution. Evan stopped asking questions entirely. He just waited. That silence lasted exactly 2 days. On Wednesday, Internal Audit sent a meeting invite titled Access Review, Urgent. This time there was an agenda. This time there were too many people on the call. Legal, security, HR. Mark joined last. They didn't ask me to explain anything. They already had the timeline. What they needed was confirmation that the documents reflected reality. So I answered yes or no. I clarified dates. I pointed out where approvals should have existed and didn't. I explained calmly how exceptions normally worked and why these ones were different. Mark tried to interrupt once, just once. Legal shut it down immediately. Let him finish. That was when the tone changed. Questions stopped being hypothetical. They became direct. Who instructed Evan to proceed without approval? Who authorized the access override? Why was compliance excluded from these meetings? Mark's answers grew slower, less confident. He started using phrases like, I don't recall, and that wasn't my intention. Evan didn't say a word. Halfway through the call, security flagged something else. An access grant issued under Mark's credentials, time-stamped during a period when he claimed to be out of office. That was the moment chaos broke through the professionalism. The call paused. People muted. Messages flew in private chats I wasn't part of. When we resumed, Legal asked for all communications between Mark and Evan immediately. The meeting ended abruptly. Within an hour, Mark's calendar was wiped. His Slack status went gray. Evan's contractor badge was deactivated by end of day. No announcement, no drama, just absence. HR finally called me that evening, not for a check-in, for an update. They told me Mark was no longer with the company, that there was an ongoing internal review, that my cooperation was appreciated. They asked if I felt comfortable continuing in my role. I said yes, because at that point, it was true. That night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, like after a fire alarm stops ringing and you're left with the smell. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. And the mess they made trying to replace me was now theirs to clean up. The company never made a public announcement. They rarely do when the story doesn't flatter them. Instead, things just settled. Processes were temporarily frozen. Access requests went back to written approvals. Legal sent out a bland email reminding everyone that verbal authorization was not authorization. Evan's name vanished from calendars and documentation like he'd never existed. 2 weeks later, HR asked to meet. This time, it wasn't a check-in. It was an offer. They wanted me to stay. Not just stay, expand my role. Formal authority. A seat in the meetings I'd been quietly excluded from. A raise that came with a carefully worded explanation about retaining institutional knowledge. I listened. I asked questions. I didn't rush, because something had shifted for me. I had won in the narrow sense. My job was safe. My decisions were validated. The people who tried to sidestep process were gone. On paper, this was the clean ending you're supposed to want. But trust doesn't reset just because a name disappears from Slack. I thought about the weeks I'd spent second-guessing myself, about how easily future-proofing turned into a strategy for erasing someone carefully, about how close I came to being the convenient story if I hadn't kept records. So I negotiated. I asked for a severance option. Voluntary, clean, documented. A reference letter signed by legal, not just a manager. Confirmation that the internal review found no fault in my conduct. And time. Enough time to leave without burning anything down. They agreed faster than I expected. My last day was quiet. I handed over documentation I'd written years before, the same way I always had. Clearly, thoroughly, without commentary. I shut down my laptop. I left my badge on the desk. No one walked me out. No one needed to. A month later, I started a new role. Different company, similar work, better boundaries. During onboarding, my new manager asked why I'd left my last job after such a long stretch. I said, "They tried to replace me before they understood what I did." He nodded, didn't ask more. Sometimes people expect a revenge speech at the end of stories like this, a dramatic confrontation, a victory lap. There wasn't one, just a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I didn't raise my voice, didn't break character, didn't play their game. I did my job. And in the end, that was enough.